I'm so pleased to be able to introduce Michael Lenz, who is Professor of Urban Planning and Public Policy, Chair of the Luskin Undergraduate Programs, and Associate Faculty Director of the Lewis Center for Regional Policy Studies. And I've actually known Mike for over 20 years, actually 21 years. I looked it up when we both worked at the Bureau Institute of Justice before graduate school. So in preparing this intro, it was just really so wonderful for me to reflect on all the ways that Mike's research and insights have really improved our understanding of public policy as it relates to housing, and very importantly, inequalities in housing. So Mike's research includes studies related to zoning and land use and segregation, housing subsidies and eviction, among other areas. He regularly publishes this work in leading academic journals, and his research has won awards from the Journal of the American Planning Association, as well as Housing Policy Debate. And so today we're really happy to be able to hear from Mike about his recently published book. So please join me in welcoming.
Thank you so much, Naomi. Yeah, I was actually considering or thinking about this week, that I've known you longer than I've known anybody in this building. I live and work I work in this building. And so this is I think I was also thinking this is kind of the opposite of the home field advantage. I look around at familiar faces and I'm more nervous than I usually am. But I've known Naomi longer than I've known any of you, and I've known Naomi longer than I've known anyone in my department. So this very, very special time for me. And, I can't say enough about CCPR as an institution, as a center. Every year I try to tell UNSF or whoever's asking me these questions about, what, my papers and my affiliation to CCPR and what I've been up to, because I've benefited so much from this center. Really, a lot of that has to do with the leadership. I had early conversations with papers with Rob when he was I think it was after he was director, but that, one of those papers ended up being, probably my most cited paper, co-authored with Pablo Makinen. Judy, every time I run into Judy somewhere on campus, we have a 5-10 minute conversation that bears some kind of fruit. Anne was super, super supportive, right when I got here, helping me with data, helping me with the class I was teaching. I mean, things that just are beyond the scope, I think, of what just kind of a, normal leader does on campus. And Jenny have been great too. So I can't say enough about you all as a group and how appreciative I am to be here. So here's my book. Okay, yeah, I've got a QR code where you can buy it if you've seen that long enough by now. We had some music, and we'll get to a little bit more of that. But the purpose of this book is to quantitatively summarize the characteristics of Black neighborhoods in the U.S. from 1970 to roughly 2020. I've got some, finally got some updated data, so I can actually say it's slightly more recent than 2020 in a sense. And I started in 1970 because it is an inflection point in Black neighborhoods for a number of reasons, having to do with the evolution of immigration, the evolution of the Great Migration, a lot of demographic movements that people in this room would be very familiar with. I discuss how these neighborhoods evolved over time, and identify where Black neighborhood socioeconomic characteristics are more promising and more challenging. And then, I try to figure out some of the public policy reasons for this variation, or some of the structural metropolitan characteristics for this variation. I saw in a book review, someone, referred to this as like an encyclopedia of Black neighborhoods. And, I think to an extent, it is something like that. And I try to weave some stories and some public policy solutions and conversations in between. And so some of the story, I think, one of the things that I think is a little bit different about this book is I have a particular hook. And that hook, turn this on a little bit without driving you away, I think, is I discuss the interplay between Black neighborhoods and Black music, and mostly centered on rap. But right now we're listening to Stevie Wonder, which comes out of the Motown label and dominant musical enterprise of the late 1960s and early 1970s, centered in Detroit. And so chapter 2 focuses on the Great Migration and the response to that Great Migration by the urban North, eventually West. Berry Gordy's Motown reflects many of the themes of this chapter in particular. Berry Gordy's father is a great migrant from Georgia to Detroit. The Gordy family is actually considerably more affluent than most Black people were in Detroit at the time, yet they were still constrained racially in a particular set of neighborhoods, which put them in close geographic proximity to people who were much poorer than them, like Smokey Robinson, like Diana Ross, like Aretha Franklin, who eventually came into the fold in Motown and helped, blow up that musical enterprise. So, it's this kind of, I'm not the first to kind of think about the fact that when the Black middle class lived together with lower income people in the Black community, it was a very different kind of socioeconomic mix, right, in these types of neighborhoods. In chapter 3, I, go to the birth of hip hop, which happens in the Bronx, which happens in a somewhat atypical Black neighborhood in a way, right? The Bronx is adjacent or is within, New York City, which is this huge economic engine, but is on very particularly bad times in the 1970s. But also, the South Bronx is heavily Latino and very, international at this time. And so hip hop actually grows out of, not just Black culture, but Latino culture, Jamaican culture. And this, kind of thinking back to the demographics, the South Bronx becomes probably the first Black neighborhood to racially transition into something else, by the 1980s and 90s. Most of the South Bronx is majority Latino. And this is a racial transition story that we'll see pop up in other places, of course, in Los Angeles. In chapter 4, I focus on Chicago, as much of the sociological literature does on Black neighborhoods. But when you want to tell a story about hip hop and neighborhoods and Chicago, you run into a bit of an issue that Chicago is actually quite underrepresented, you would say, in hip hop culture and import. When you think about the size of its Black population, you think about also a history of a substantial role in Black music that you see in the blues, you see in jazz, doesn't really occur in the city of Chicago. I kind of, float a hypothesis or two about the role of concentrated disadvantage that is a little bit more extreme in Chicago, is considerably more extreme in the Midwest, and we'll talk about that a little bit more. And so there's not really a big industry that's related to Black music, rap music in the late 20th century and the early 21st century in Chicago that you might expect. And then if you want to kind of think about, other connections that are certainly of interest, I would point you to Forrest Stewart's book, The Ballad of the Bullet, in which he talks about the interplay between Chicago's gang culture and its hip hop musical artists in the last decade or so. Very, very important read, I think, and not a very happy story to say the least. Happy story. Gangsta rap on the West Coast. Mixed, I will say. So here we are in Los Angeles. Enormous role in the evolution of hip hop culture, in a hip hop industry, a toehold in kind of the advanced advancement of like a financially viable industry attached to Black music. You know, a lot of this, of course, comes on the back of particularly violent imagery that comes out of music from NWA, who we're listening to right now. But NWA also had some very productive stories to tell, I think, right? So we get to the early 1990s. We've heard for years by then from NWA about, and other artists about, police violence in the Black community. And I think we have a vocabulary to discuss this. We have an understanding of what we are seeing when Rodney King is beaten by police officers not too far from here. So it's always a mixed bag, I think, right? We have these stories to tell, but these stories have been, have certainly played a role in kind of a negative perception of Black neighborhoods, certainly in Los Angeles, but well beyond these shores. Also, LA's rap story is very suburban and it's very car culture oriented in ways that I discussed a little bit more in detail in the book. And of course, are also interesting to an urban planner type thing. DC plays a big role in the book. And then even more so than Chicago, you go to DC and you see a large concentration of Black people. You think about this, the various Black communities that have evolved substantially over time, but remain in the area. And you see almost no musical import in hip hop coming out of Washington, D.C., unless you're a big fan of like Wale, and I won't ask for a show of hands. Go-go and punk, to a lesser extent, if you're thinking about the Black community, is an enormous feature of DC's musical culture, and perhaps many of those artists might have become hip-hop artists elsewhere, but in DC, you could explain the absence of this big hip-hop industry or life by go-go, where its geographic center is in the Shaw and U Street neighborhood, which has seen the most dramatic change in gentrification and racial transition of that type that we've seen anywhere else in the country. Shaw U Street was 87% Black in 1970. By 2017-ish, that's 25% Black. And while we can find other Black neighborhoods, certainly not very far from here, that have racially transitioned from Black to Latino throughout the country, this kind of racial transition from Black to white is unheard of anywhere else. Another city I talk a fair amount about in the book is Atlanta. And I think one way that Atlanta, it has not just a important, musical role in hip hop culture as the center of hip hop right now, in the last 10 or 15 years, as a chief influencer of the sound that you hear in pop music overall. Just ask Beyonce or Gaga. I think the rise of hip hop culture in the South connects to the rise of economic fortune in the South and the rise of a broader cultural, and I think a broader cultural rise in the South that is not just central to Atlanta, and I think connects the extent to which we see return migration of Black Americans to the South. I think it connects to the broader population and economic increases in the South. If the South has long been kind of stereotyped as a cultural backwater in this country, that stereotype is increasingly out of date. And I think that, portends a lot for where we think people are going to land and stay in different regions in this country. Okay. I'm not done with music yet. We started when you were walking in Thank you to Panda Express for the catering. When you were walking in with your food, we were listening to a song called Where the Hood At. That's the name of the book. Where the Hood At is a song by DMX. This is DMX, aka Earl Simmons. And, I'll be honest, y'all are family, I gotta be honest with you. I didn't come into this book title thinking about all the connections that I could make between DMX and Fair House. Did stumble into some of these later. I thought the book title sounded cool. I thought there was a double or maybe triple entendre, right? Like, where's the hood at, like, geographically? That's what I'm trying to describe. Where's it at in the pecking order of neighborhoods in this country? I could, and so I could kind of, and then where is it at in its trajectory? Like, that was my kind of initial thinking. Not good with titles, so I was happy with that. It turns out DMX has a lot to do with fair housing. He's born in 1970, which was the first convenient accident, right? This is where my book starts in terms of the data I'm grabbing, the story I'm trying to tell. He's born in Mount Vernon, New York. He grows up in public housing in Yonkers, New York. Yonkers in Westchester County more broadly is the site of the most sustained opposition to public housing transformation and desegregation that you see anywhere in the country. When Earl Simmons was 10 years old, the federal government sued the various Yonkers city agencies for intentionally segregating public housing in the city. This is concurrent with ongoing litigation with the county of Westchester that Yonkers sits in about housing desegregation and public housing segregation. And so there's this whole fair housing fight. I'll get into a little bit more of that. And then, right now, DMX is not, DMX might not be as kind of salient to people who listen to hip hop these days, but between 1998 and 2003, he releases 5 albums that all debut, platinum, or debut #1 on the Billboard chart. Sorry, to get that specific. He's the biggest, certainly the biggest rap artist of the time, other than maybe Jay-Z. He's one of the biggest musical artists of that time, period. Fair housing at Yonkers has a, again, longest sustained opposition to desegregation that you see in the country. And it looks like this. In 1987, Mayor Nick Wasicsko, who's pictured in this book jacket, or no, this is the HBO miniseries version. Not a lot of HBO miniseries about fair housing, you might already be aware. So this rose to that level of attention. And this was a story where a very activist federal court helped to mandate the actual enforcement of this desegregation plan, right? So the city loses this litigation battle with the federal government, but it takes a federal judge to really kind of follow through. Wasicsko comes in thinking that he's going to get out of this, right? That he's, okay, you guys told us we need to do this thing, and here's how we're going to wiggle our way out. This very activist federal judge holds their feet to the fire. He reluctantly, the mayor, leads on this plan and is defeated, a couple of years later in a backlash election. He tragically dies by suicide at the age of 34. And then we have this mini series, and the book by Lisa Belkin is really quite good as well. In 2021, kind of furthering these kind of trajectories between DMX and this fair housing fight, and kind of this trajectory in my book is A federal monitor rules in favor of Westchester County in 2021, basically ending the federal role of desegregation after lots of wins, lots of successes in terms of scattering public housing throughout Westchester County to a limited extent, and desegregating to a limited extent. And that April, Earl Simmons, or DMX, dies at the age of 50 after, a up and down life, we shall say. So that's a little bit more detail on some of the kind of hook in the cultural connections in the book. Let's get back to some data. So I'm motivated by a few things when I started kind of writing this book. You take a neighborhood like Yonkers, where DMX grew up. It was a Black neighborhood when he was kind of very young, evolves into mostly Latino neighborhood. That's not a very typical Black neighborhood. And so I'm trying to capture what that typicality looks like, kind of both on an average and, kind of variation of those trajectories. And, like many people who study demography more specifically, I'm motivated by, disparities between various groups. And I'm trying to understand how space and neighborhood influence those things. We know a lot of research that suggests that concentrated disadvantage in neighborhoods is really important for these sorts of outcomes. But we also understand that these disparities are not, that the mechanisms behind these disparities are different for neighborhoods and different for individuals. And so studying neighborhoods, I think, on their own as a unit is important. All right, enough about music and motivations. Where are the data? First, what is a Black neighborhood? So I define a Black neighborhood as one in which Blacks are the largest racial or ethnic group. I only have 4 racial or ethnic groups that I'm looking at, hamstrung by census data and how we define race and ethnicity in this country. So there's a limitation there, of course. The other kind of limitation you might be thinking is like, well, maybe you want to define it as a majority, where Blacks are a majority. In almost all cases, early on in this data, where Blacks are the largest racial or ethnic group, they're actually a majority. Yeah, that's 98% of the time in 1970. In 2017, that's down to 80%, right? So like the way that segregation tends to work in this country is that when Blacks are the largest racial ethnic group in a neighborhood, they're a majority. They're, not just a plurality. So it doesn't really matter that much. Although, as we'll see, like these neighborhoods are diversifying racially. And I use data, chiefly from the census. I had big ambitions to use a bunch of other data sets. Got, way too much content out of the census, and here we are. And so that was enough work as it was. Some of the things I find, Black neighborhoods are concentrated regionally, right? They're concentrated, largely in our major metropolitan areas, obviously, but also concentrated in the South, right, where Black populations are much larger. And then, in terms of thinking about where attributes are better or worse, the socioeconomic strength in Black neighborhoods is much kind of better in the South and in the West, but Black neighborhoods are generally disappearing in the West. And so I'll show you some data on that. The kind of biggest headline finding, I would say, is like a limited convergence in many socioeconomic characteristics between Black neighborhoods and white neighborhoods. Those people who study, Black individuals and racial disparities would be familiar with this, right? That along, a lot of kind of characteristics, there is a convergence in these and a kind of reduction in some disparities, but it's very slow going. I think another thing to highlight is that like the Black neighborhood success stories that we see in the data are much more successful than they used to be. So back in 1980, if you looked at a Black neighborhood and or ranked all Black neighborhoods from 1 to 3,000, your kind of top 5 to 10% of neighborhoods would be like a lower class neighborhood socioeconomically. Now that's more like a middle class neighborhood. So like there are true Black middle-class neighborhoods, small number of them, but they do exist. And then, I probably won't dwell too much on the regression findings that I have later, but, one of the things that I think really stands out in the data is that it's really, really hard to have strong Black neighborhood characteristics without a strong, metropolitan economy, strong regional economy. And so that variation is really quite salient, I think, across metropolitan areas, more so than within. So here's what I mean about limited convergence. So in 1970, the average Black neighborhood was about 3 times as impoverished as the average Black neighborhood. That's down to 2 to 1 by 2010, and ever since, slowly creeping, even lower than 2 to 1 in kind of recent data. So this shows the average, and this is just those poverty rates in detail. And you'll see that this convergence comes from both sides, right? So the average poverty rate in Black neighborhoods goes from 27% down to 23%. It's now down to 22% in the most recent ACS. So I've updated some of ththese tables using the most recent ACS. But the average poverty rate in non-Black neighborhoods goes from 9 to 12. And that's still 12 in the latest ACS. Something's going on there, of course, is the diversification of every neighborhood or every type of neighborhood across the country, right? We've got, significant numbers of significant waves of immigration happening during this time period. We have, just the diversification of urban America across several dimensions, right? So some of that contributes to this increase in the increase in the average poverty rate in non-Black neighborhoods, but the average poverty rate in Black neighborhoods, going down, 4 to 5% over this time period is pretty substantial. It's not as substantial as the drop in the average poverty rate for Black households, which goes down from 35% to 23%. I think I could go on and on about housing markets and property markets here. I think there is a stickiness, to how people kind of perceive Black neighborhoods and the extent to which they are likely to want to live in those neighborhoods. That comes from legacies of racial discrimination in housing. But I also think there's some reasons to be a little bit more optimistic about that. I'll talk about that in a second. So this is more of that kind of racial story, right? Where Black neighborhoods are becoming much more racially diverse over time. In 1970, Black neighborhoods were 81% Black. That's down to 62% Black in the most recent ACS. And then, if you look at the kind of share of whites living in Black neighborhoods, that's basically held steady for roughly 50 years. And you might think, oh, well, that suggests that we have this, kind of strong, consistent bias on behalf of whites against living in Black neighborhoods. The thing to remember is that whites are much lower share of the overall metropolitan population, right? So in non-Black neighborhoods, they go down from 94% to 62%, which means that if you pluck a white individual out of the data set, they're much more likely to live in a Black neighborhood than they ever were before. And that's what this looks like. This tells us this kind of in figure form, which in 1980, the average white individual is 8 times as likely to live outside of a Black neighborhood than within one. And by 2017, that's more like 3.2-ish to 1. Yeah.
How much of this is integration versus gentrification? This is just a process.
I have. Yeah, I mean, chapter 6, we're dancing in that milieu, and I'll have some more to say about that. Do I know exactly how much? No. I think the integration versus gentrification, which is it? When is it both? When is it one and not the other? Conversation is fascinating, and I think there's no simple answer to it. But yeah, I'll get into some more of that, but I want to hear more of your reflection after we get through some of that. So thank you. So it's on me because I talked about bias and stuff. Like how much of this is like a reduction to bias? How much of this is like, oh, that Black neighborhood gentrified for me and here I come, or I am the gentrifier? I don't know. More to come on that. So this relates somewhat. And I, spend a lot of my time studying housing affordability, studying housing production. And so some of what I focus on in the book, policy wise and kind of markets wise, is related to housing. And so this figure looks at the percent of housing units that are built more than 30 years ago, so kind of aged housing. And that's these top two lines. The bottom two lines is the percent of housing units that's built in the last 10 years. So that's newer housing. And we see in both cases, for Black neighborhoods in gray and non-Black neighborhoods in red, in both cases, housing's getting older. Right? We're not building as much housing as we used to. Back in 1970, we were building quite a lot of housing around our metropolitan areas. And now most of our housing is that old housing stock still standing around, right? And what I find interesting here is this convergence between Black and non-Black neighborhoods. If you go way back into kind of the birth of some of our urban problems as it pertains to race, it was the fact that one of these mechanisms was that Black people were kind of isolated, shunted into aging neighborhoods with the oldest housing stock, neighborhoods with the housing stock that was most likely to fall apart, right? Now, I'm not saying everybody's housing is falling apart, but everybody's housing is pretty old. And most importantly, the difference in age between Black and non-Black neighborhoods is narrowing quite considerably. This could lead to further gentrification of Black neighborhoods because now you have a housing stock that's no worse off generally than the housing stock that's in non-Black neighborhoods. Some of this, though, I think is going to be, there's some measurement error when you think about kind of rehabilitation of some of these properties. So it's not a perfect story there. But I think this is a very important indicator of what we might see in the future when we think about differences in demand for living in different types of neighborhoods, which traditionally has been a very, very big limiting factor for Black neighborhood strength.
I wonder on the top line, there are those housing units that are built 70 years ago, while the red line underneath are housing units that were built 40 years ago, so they're taking the stock of 1970 of those newer units, and then so there's still maybe some more divergence, and the Black neighborhoods have 70 or 80-year-old houses versus 30 or 40-year-old.
Oh, yeah.
The threshold.
No, that's a great point. So yeah, the point being that, since like in 1970, 1980, there was such a big gap, 30 years is almost not long enough as a time period to kind of look at differences in housing stock. Yeah, and I think that's definitely relevant in a lot of places. Not even, you don't have to go outside of Los Angeles, right? I mean, much of kind of central Los Angeles was built, 100 years ago or less. And so, yeah. I think that's another kind of measurement,
like downtown LA houses are 100 years old. In the valley, they're more like 40 years old, 50 years old. Yeah.
Right. Yes. Nobody has pointed that out to me before. I like that. As a housing person, I need to think about that more. So another thing where this relates to our story of kind of wanting to peer into a crystal ball and see what's going to happen in the future in some of these neighborhoods, is that rents are rising everywhere. This gap between rents in Black neighborhoods, which is the lower figure, in non-Black neighborhoods, is narrowing. Not super quickly, but it's not cheap to live in a Black neighborhood anymore, if it ever was. And so, that relates, I think, to the scarcity of housing that's happening everywhere. It relates to increased demand for living in central cities or staying in central cities, which I think, is certainly findable in the data that, people are, forming households, moving to the suburbs at kind of later stages in life, which is putting, increased pressure on, central city areas of which Black neighborhoods are overrepresented in, right? So that's something to watch, and it's not great news for renters in Black neighborhoods, of course. On the home value front, Black neighborhoods rebounded quite slowly from the Great Recession. That's, in the most recent ACS starting to look like it's finally turned around a little bit better. The kind of big challenge in Black neighborhoods, of course, is that homeownership rates are considerably lower. I think it's something like 40-something% over here, and you're looking at 70-something% in non-Black neighborhoods, right? Or if you look at the household level, it's 40-something for Black households and 70-something for white households, right? So like the home ownership rate is meaning that those kind of increases in value are not returning to people at the same rate as they are in other neighborhoods. Okay, so honing more in on socioeconomic characteristics in Black neighborhoods, where they thriving and struggling. First, kind of big picture, big country, 4 regions, but a lot you can learn from 4 regions. Midwest, in the Northeast, more of the aging metros in the Northeast, you see, considerable poverty, considerably high poverty rates in Black neighborhoods. There's also a wider gap between Black neighborhoods and non-Black neighborhoods in most of these places, and I'll talk a little bit more about that. So it's not just like absolute disadvantage, but also relative disadvantage in those parts of the country. The South is where poverty rates are not just relatively low in Black neighborhoods, but also where you have the fastest growth in Black neighborhoods. And then again, poverty, the socioeconomic conditions are best in Black neighborhoods in the West, but there aren't that many. Yeah.
So Chelsea, are these but when you measure poverty, right, are we sort of regionally adjusting this in any way, or is it just using like a federal poverty?
Oh, no, this is federal poverty. Yeah.
Because I do wonder, especially in the West, right, or like LA, which cost of living is
very different. Yeah.
I always find this poverty measure just very hard to interpret.
Yeah. And I guess like looking at percent of AMI or area median income might get you some different stories here. Trying to think of. Yeah, I'm just trying to think of, like, could you figure that out, like locationally, like census tract? I'm not sure.
And you lose something if you do that too, because you're talking about the intercity comparison.
Right.
So I don't know how the right way to do this.
Yeah.
Maybe SPM, like supplemental poverty measure, but I
Yeah.
think you can do that at the neighborhood level.
Yeah, and it's not I guess SPM, what's the regional correction there?
They
Locational
include
correction.
like cost of housing.
Okay.
The need side is like cost of living adjusted.
Okay. That's interesting. Yeah. It's something to look at further. Well, really bad news is this is almost irrelevant on the West Coast. There are no Black neighborhoods with some, it's not zero, but it's something like 3% of the nation's total now, right? It was always the lowest, right? This is where the Great Migration did not make it quite as in quite the kind of intensity as other parts of the country. But just kind of, there's a scattering of the Black population in Los Angeles that's well known. There's there are a smaller number of people that have left the state altogether, right? And many of them are going to the South. And so that's kind of, what that looks like on this figure. Randall.
This is so fascinating. I'm just wondering, given these kind of trends, does it force you to think about a more nuanced definition of what it means to be in a Black neighborhood?
Yeah, I think we're getting closer to that point demographically. Like I said, like at the beginning, I was talking about how, in 1970, defining a Black neighborhood, 1980, defining a Black neighborhood, that was easy, right? Like if Blacks are the largest racial ethnic group, it's almost zero Black neighborhoods were like 35, 35, 35, right? It's, 75 and others, right? Now that's a different story. And I think especially and then thinking about, the West, one of the reasons why there's been a decline in Black neighborhoods that's much faster in the West is because this is where your racially integrated Black neighborhoods were all along, right? So in 1970, 1980, there were already, Black neighborhoods that were 45% Black and 35% Latino, right? That was happening probably in much of South Los Angeles. And so I think, in the West, what it means to be a Black neighborhood is quite different than in these places. And then the 21st century West is different than the 21st century West. So that was a long yes. Great idea, Randall. Thank you.
So I mean, I think what's sort of interesting is when you hear people talk about moving, say, from majority Black neighborhoods to other areas, and again, I'm very California centric here.
Yeah.
A lot of what I hear people saying is that they're sort of that being a plurality doesn't indicate safety or a sense of belonging in the way that they might experience in the high desert.
Interesting. Yeah. Agreed.
Actually, kind of going off of Randall's question, I was wondering, and maybe you'll get to this, but how going forward, the sense of community that was in Black neighborhoods and now, as the numbers are declining, is no longer available. What sources of community are people turning to instead of neighborhood,
Yeah, I mean, that I think I don't have a great answer to that question. I mean, obviously my mind does turn to the social media or other ways that we create community for better or worse in the 21st century, but I don't study that whatsoever, so I don't know. But and then I think I could also be overplaying the extent to which Black community is disappearing, right? It's just there are several neighborhoods that have racially transitioned in the last 30, 50 years. There's a story in the West that particularly looks at that says Black people were never a large racial or ethnic group in this part of the country, and they're even more kind of dispersed than they used to be, and so that community is diminishing spatially. But then you look at the South and it's a very, very different story. So I just don't want to over emphasize this decline in community.
So it almost feels like this chart's picking up two things, right? You have a concentration measure, which is making it so of neighborhoods, and a sort of share of the Black population in the region over time. Right?
Yeah.
There's a drop a lot in California and other places. So I don't know how to necessarily interpret sort of. I think it is interesting. I don't know how to think about which is dominating here.
Yeah, yeah. And I mean, on this figure, I think that's impossible to tell. And again, it varies. It varies from metro to metro. Different. And
And I think something about this line for the West that I think about is the fact that I forget when this number came out, but more people live in California are renters and lower income people who stay in California and going to the South and becoming homeowners than renters. So there's also a trend of who is living, like, I mean, California is not the West, but
right.
you know, speaking from like moving to the West elsewhere and then seeing the South concentration go, makes me think of that regional also relationship in migration, not just in the neighborhood, but also in from the West out to more affordable places.
Right. And that's like, for many people, that's a great outcome, right? And you're also, serving up a pitch for me to hit when I talk about people moving to the South is a good outcome, which I'll get to in a bit. But like, part of that is like the potential for home ownership that is like really, really out of reach around here. For obvious reasons. Okay. So I've already talked about this a little bit. When we look at kind of the negative outcomes that we see in the Midwest and really the aging, smaller metros of the Northeast, like the Northeast story there's like two Northeast stories quickly. Like there's New York and Boston and major metropolitan areas, and then there's like Albany and Syracuse and Pennsylvania, parts of Pennsylvania, right? Like so when I talk about aging Northeast metros, like those are the places, that latter group looks more like the Midwest. And so as I talked about introduced before, like it's not just that in the Rust Belt people have lower incomes. It's not just that in the Rust Belt, like neighborhoods have more poverty, right? It's Black neighborhoods in particular are farther behind than other neighborhoods in those types of metros, right? And I will cherry pick the data. I'm sorry, but this is, I think a really, emblematic example. Peoria, Illinois, had 10 census tracts. It's got a fairly decent sized Black neighborhood for a metropolitan area as small as it is. The Peoria MSA unemployment rate was only 6%, right? This is a place that has had lots of manufacturing losses over the last 20, 30 years, but there's still a strong economy that employs 94% of its people. The unemployment rate in Black neighborhoods ranged from 12 to 31%, right? The poverty rate in Black neighborhoods was 41%. That's above the above the 30% threshold. It's above the 40% threshold for extreme poverty, right? So it's not just that the Midwest has higher poverty rates in its urban areas. It's that Black neighborhoods are particularly disadvantaged relatively. The positive story, I talk again a lot about Atlanta and DC. This, people call them the Black Meccas of the South, whatever. This is more of a recent kind of positive story for Atlanta than DC, but both of them, have some recency to it in that, 1970 and 1980, both of them had poverty rates in Black neighborhoods above 20%. I don't have the updated numbers that I could point to over there, but 14% in DC is roughly the national average poverty rate, right? In Atlanta, it's more like 17, 18%. Those are very, very important success stories. And it's also the case that we're talking about hundreds of Black census tracts, right? These are some of the largest Black populations in the country, just in terms of aggregate numbers. And then in terms of affluence, it's also very good. That's the good news. The bad news is housing. This is your average, neighborhood house value in DC. That's over $300,000. Atlanta's moving, more slowly, but if I updated this, it would probably look more expensive. And so that's the big question, right? Can Black people remain in these, in the Black neighborhoods that have been established in these cities for many, many decades, where demand is clearly rising? And in DC, we already have an example of, of the Shaw U Street neighborhood that has completely racially transitioned and is very, very expensive. And, only a quarter of that population remains Black. I tried to do some work to figure out, what do we know about regions and metropolitan economies and kind of other features of neighborhoods that seem to influence poverty rates in Black neighborhoods. So ransom regression models, 170 metros over, 6 or 7 different, points in time, and, found some kind of some fairly consistent correlations. A lot of people who've done this kind of analysis in the past looked at, factors of the metropolitan area economy, and then kind of how that metropolitan area economy is split. So looking at issues at kind of measures of inequality. So kind of your metro GDP, your metro average family income is very, very strongly correlated. So again, you can't really have strong Black neighborhoods without strong economies more broadly. I also find that the share Black in a city, or in a metropolitan area, is positively correlated with neighborhood poverty rates. So kind of a strength in numbers hypothesis. And then lower inequality rates do matter. Segregation doesn't matter as much, as once you control for other things like the neighborhood features. You don't really see much of an impact of segregation, although inequality is more robust. What else? And then, some of the kind of typical neighborhood features, right? Female headship, unemployment rates, high school diploma, or share without high school diploma. Yeah.
Did you look at the proportion that is foreign-born immigrant population?
Did I? I don't remember if the
So-
share of foreign-born is. Do you mean in the metropolitan area
Or in the neighborhood?
neighborhood?
Well, when you made your profile of Harlem, you talk about the foreign-born population.
Yeah.
And that reminded me of a story of another success story, the closing of the life expectancy gap between Black and white recently. And the paper just came out that shows that contribution to that was the increase the proportion foreign-born among the Black population.
Yeah, that's cool. That's really interesting.
Migrant.
Yeah, and I think one of the limitations of the book certainly is that some of the neighborhoods that I'm looking at are majority foreign-born Blacks, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like there's not a tremendous amount of these neighborhoods around the country, but there's areas of Miami, there's areas in Brooklyn, that where the population is more Caribbean than African American. And so those are different types of neighborhoods with different, different, challenges and positive things going on. I didn't really look at kind of that immigration connection so much. I spent more time thinking about non-Black immigrants and the kind of ways in which those populations, which are, larger, but the ways in which those populations are changing cities and changing Black neighborhoods, changing non-Black neighborhoods. And then I get regular feedback about what about African, people from Africa, people from the Caribbean. It's there's a good book by Todd Hamilton on that, I think, Immigration and the Remaking of Black America, I think it's called.
Yeah.
But yeah, I that's something I do wish to explore more.
I'm curious if you looked at household composition or family structure, and if that what that looks like regionally, and if that's changed in different ways over time.
No,
Different regions, or-
Household composition and family structure, I mean, I definitely did not look at that outside of like, controlling for, the present, I think the share of Black neighborhoods that were, single parent female headed households, right? I don't think I looked at that. So like what connections might you make there?
Gosh, I just wonder if it's, I guess I'm just wondering if it's like held steady in terms of family structure and composition, like over time, and or if it's changed in different ways across regions, and if that makes a difference.
Right.
And I guess that kind of, I guess I'm assuming that you're looking at it at the household level, or is poverty?
Well, I mean, the base measure is like, households in poverty, but like, yeah, everything's aggregated to the neighborhood, right? But yeah, I don't know what the family structure, I don't know what the family structure trends are in ways that like almost everybody in this room would know better than me, probably.
Not me, yeah.
Thank you. Yeah.
I'm curious about from what I understand, when you're doing the like overtime measures, a neighborhood that was Black but is no longer wouldn't be in like Black neighborhood averages. And I was gonna say, if that's the case,
Right.
it might be interesting too to look at like define a Black neighborhood in 1970 and then follow it and
Right.
see like how it changes, or
Right.
and then do the opposite, like
Right.
these like maybe Atlanta suburbs that weren't Black
Right.
in 1970 that are now Black.
Mhm.
What were they like in 1970? And
Yeah.
as like in a set of like this Venn diagram of like neighborhoods that have stayed throughout, used to be Black neighborhoods, now are Black neighborhoods, and see like,
Yes.
so like what, factors are related to these things happening.
You need to read chapter 5. So I don't report any of that right now for sake of time. Turns out that talking about a book is hard in an hour or so. But like I'm so excited that you're into this because I do like an analysis of, I think what I call them most of the time is like exiters, so like Black neighborhood exiting that status, and like new Black neighborhoods. And so I do try to, and then some of this is connected to gentrification as well. So it's like then looking at racial transition and gentrification. Slide coming up on that, I think. But so yeah, I do some work on that. I think I also maybe even run some models on that. And a year ago, maybe I would have remembered what's in there, but not today.
Chapter 5, I gotta read it.
Chapter 5, let's talk about it. Okay, so speaking of hurtling towards the end of this talk, I better go. So one way that I do talk about, specifically, of course, about like, Black neighborhoods becoming something else, this Exeter story, or whatever. Like one of these pieces is gentrification. In this bit here, I'm talking more kind of like trying to explain whether like some of the positive trajectories that we see, and this is getting a little bit to your question, like some of the positive trajectories that we see looks more like gentrification or like a rising, number of Black middle class neighborhoods. The short story in terms of analytically is like, I think, what you want to look for in terms of gentrification is, more like, is demand rising for those in those neighborhoods? And that is like housing demand, right? Like rents, home values. On the other hand, if you think you're seeing like more of a middle class rise, that's probably captured in income. And then, I do like some more specific analyses of like the share of Black neighborhoods that gentrify or do not. And then, sometimes it's both. And then also the overwhelming circumstance just proportionally in Black neighborhoods is continued disadvantage or relative disadvantage. So we always have to remember when we're talking about gentrification or a rising Black middle class, we're talking about a minority of neighborhoods. That's, I think, important to remember. Is there rising demand for living in Black neighborhoods? I think that's clear from the data. I think that's clear from, like, again, delayed household formation and other, factors of like urban demand that seem to kind of favor Black neighborhood demand. And then I talk about this age gap between Black and non-Black neighborhoods. Jenny poked an awesome little hole in that data, that maybe there are some age differences that I'm not fully capturing. Yes, true. What do I know on the kind of Black middle class gentrification dichotomy, which is not perfectly a dichotomy? I find kind of on this broad question that more of these of the upward trajectory in Black neighborhoods looks like gentrification than rising Black middle class neighborhoods. If you look at the share of Black neighborhoods in the top quartile of home values, that's gone from 4% to 10%. So that's like a lot of demand rise, right? In terms of like income rise, 4% of Black neighborhoods are in the top income quartile, up from 3% in 1980. So not a ton of income rise compared to this demand rise. There are more like sophisticated ways of measuring gentrification. And where does that look like? So gentrification rates in Black neighborhoods, one kind of, common finding in the literature on segregation is that Black neighborhoods don't gentrify as quickly, right? In, the last 30 or 40 years of people looking at this as like other low poverty neighborhoods or Latino neighborhoods. Long legacies of racial discrimination against people wanting to move into those neighborhoods has a lot to do with that, probably. I'm finding that stopped being the case around 2010, right? So Black neighborhood gentrification rates were considerably lower in 2000 than in lower poverty neighborhoods and Hispanic neighborhoods. By 2010, it's much more similar. Yeah.
So you're characterizing this as a sort of a demand, the price as a measure of demand. But I'm wondering, based on your housing chart, whether or not in this case the price change is as much a measure of supply, right? Because you showed that housing that dropped in all of these neighborhoods, and sort of it brings up sort of, I think, a bigger policy question of whether or not some of these like anti-gentrification policies that have been pushed over the last 20 years, which restrict supply, might actually not. What do those do to these neighborhoods if they show up as an increase in housing prices?
Right. So this is all looking at demographic change. So this is like, changes in, people with a BA, there's some race in here, there's some income in here. This is telling us nothing about housing, which you're astutely pointing out that contradicts kind of how I measured it a couple slides ago. But so I can't say much about like what housing interventions would connect to this. It's just kind of showing us that like there's a different population of people that are like moving to Black neighborhoods now than ever. And like that also is just like picking up rapid socioeconomic change in these neighborhoods, right? Because I'm looking at like, which had a big jump of people with BAs and they're white and they're higher income. Okay. That's mixed news. Okay, we got 8 minutes. So I'll start a policy conversation by, let's see, the finding story, slow improvement, fair amount of evidence for gentrification where it happens. Metro level characteristics matter a lot. Strong regional economies matter a lot. I want to also put a pin in the fact that Black people routinely report that they want to live in Black neighborhoods. We've already talked about kind of the importance of kind of retaining Black community. There's a big set of positive stories happening out of the South. Here's kind of where I want to start this policy conversation, and you can ask me anything, it doesn't have to be policy. I think there's three things I talk the most about. Having a regional focus with our interventions. One is like, we have talked probably way more than we need to about like housing mobility options that move people from neighborhood to neighborhood within metropolitan areas where we have like some success, but not a ton. We have a lot more options for success for people when they move metropolitan areas as a whole, when they move regions entirely. So you can make bigger changes in your neighborhood situation that way. And if you want like the most affluent Black neighborhood options to find, you live in the upper Midwest or whatever, like there's nowhere for you to go other than the South. There's many, many more options for you in the South. So there's that kind of a regional focus. I talk a fair amount about housing interventions like land trusts and like, you know, integrating the suburbs more, because that's where you could, you know, both take advantage of options for people to build equity as well as like better neighborhood outcomes. And then investing in people. I think it's impossible to have like, you know, big improvements in neighborhoods without actually, you know, addressing our individual level disparity. So there's more details in further slides, but I don't have time for that. I'm putting it down. We can talk more about policy or any, you know, kind of questions you have on where we were already.
Yeah, I have a question about the beginning part. I think was kind of, if I understood it right, seems like an interesting theory, is that like there are some cultural products that come out of racially segregated but economically integrated neighborhoods. If I understand that right. So like a Black neighborhood where all my neighbors are Black, but they have varying incomes. And I wonder if that generalizes beyond the music setting to like, I don't know, other art forms, educational outcomes.
Wow, yeah, that's super interesting. And yeah, you know, I think I try to be careful in the book to not try to be like an armchair, you know, cultural studies scholar. But you know, I do make a case at a few different points that there is an important interplay between culture, you know, in this case, music, musical economy, and neighborhood perception. I think is really important in this story. Like I talked briefly about like, you know, LA and like, you know, where the kind of cultural transmission of what it's like to grow up in the hood, right? Like gets transmitted all over the world about like, you know, what Black South and South Los Angeles looks like in 1989 or whatever. But, you know, getting back to, I think what's more your question is like, you know, I think there's also a story that, you know, honestly, I think I'm a little bit less qualified to talk about of like, you know, an interesting like alchemy of, you know, poverty, economics, race, and kind of cultural development that happens in neighborhoods like this. Like, yeah, I talk a fair amount about the Detroit story being like a, you know, partly based on economic integration. You know, I think Atlanta's neighborhoods look very different in terms of what they've produced in the last 10 or 15 years, but it's a similar, somehow it ends up being a similar outcome. And yeah, I don't know what this, I think the frustrating thing is that so much of this stuff is unpredictable and unreplicable. Is that the word? I don't know. Like how could you just produce that in other domains or reproduce that in other domains? That's what I think is less, it's more opaque to me, maybe. Yeah.
I'm trying to formulate this as a question because you're just making me think about a lot of different things. But I grew up in Portland, Oregon, and it is like an extremely not racially diverse place at all. And
there was a Black neighborhood there once. Maybe it's still there.
And I'm from the suburbs even more so. So it was just very, yeah, not a diverse place to grow up. But I was really excited. I moved to Washington, D.C. after college, and it was an amazing, like, dynamic city to be in. And so following up on like Ian's question, like this idea that in these neighborhoods, there's like something like rich and powerful, whether it is art or like culture or business or something that spills over and benefits the broader community. But then a few slides back, you also said like when Black neighborhoods are polled, there's this tension of like, we want to retain the character of this community. And so then how do you kind of envision that going forward? Like, what does a ideal Black neighborhood look like to you in like 50 or 100 years?
Yeah, wow. Yeah, I probably started writing this book thinking I would find something like an answer to that. I think one thing that I have probably returned to in this, in similar questions and challenges of thinking about these issues is like ownership, right? And I'm far from the first person to, put my finger on this. Is like, as long as people have, there's the owners, there's the financial ownership, there's the property ownership, and that's limited in these neighborhoods, right? And then, there's also questions of, kind of whether, I don't know, it's political ownership or ownership over the decisions that are made that might impact this neighborhood. To me, like, as long as you have one or both of those things in decent numbers, then, it's not up to me to kind of figure out what that idea looks like. It's up to the people that are there. But like those ownership shares are so much lower in these neighborhoods in particular, and that's the rub, right? You would be fine with whatever, destiny comes as long as they had some control over it and some benefit from it, as owners. But that's not typical. And so it's the bad news, right? I think I'm out of time, aren't I?
Oh, yes. Okay. Yeah, we're over time.
I'll stay up here all day. We got a plane to catch, but it's like a few hours away. Thank you.
Thank you.